It was generally agreed among the regular congregation of St. Mildred's that nothing in the building ever changed unless a committee said it might, and even then the change would be so slight as to require a newsletter announcement to confirm it had happened. Thus the appearance of a faint, persistent draught beneath the central pews came to be regarded not as a structural anomaly, but as something of a personal affront. The vicar, Reverend Elman Prowse, first noticed it on a Monday morning, when he entered the church, intending to rehearse a sermon whose theme, on the virtues of steadfast calm, he would later find painfully ironic. The draught touched his ankles in a manner he considered both impolite and vaguely accusatory. Having spent the weekend assuring several parishioners that the church floor had been perfectly sound for decades, he felt the building might have chosen an unfortunate moment to contradict him. Inspector Purbright, who had been passing through the market square at the time and had no particular wish to be drawn into clerical turbulence, was summoned nonetheless with gentle but unmistakable urgency. The Reverend Prowse greeted him with the anxious conviction of one who suspects divine judgment but hopes for municipal intervention. "I wouldn't trouble you," Prowse began, his fingers shaping a hesitant steeple, "but the situation has developed a quality I find unsettling." Purbright surveyed the nave with the mild, patient courtesy he reserved for matters likely to grow complicated. "A draught, I gather?" he asked, as though inquiring after the health of a family pet. "A draught," Prowse repeated gravely, "and a rather insistent one. It seems to come from beneath the floorboards. I've checked the windows twice." Purbright knelt, tapped a polished board, and listened. The floor answered with a hollow, unpersuaded thud. He tried another, and then another. Each responded with the sort of sound one associates with attics, disused cupboards, and places in which things are left, intentionally or otherwise. The Reverend paled. "It didn't sound like that before," he muttered. "I expect it did," Purbright said gently. "Only now you are listening for it." Several parish committee members, summoned by the vicar through a sequence of increasingly urgent telephone calls, arrived at this moment looking as though they had been interrupted in the middle of dignified but unproductive work. Mrs. Tapping, chairwoman of the Floral Guild and unofficial custodian of all church propriety, approached with the brisk dignity of a woman whose reputation could not, under any circumstance, become entangled with floorboards. "Inspector," she said, "I do hope you are not about to recommend any form of disturbance. We have the bishop's visit next month. It would be most unsuitable to have visible repairs." Purbright assured her that no disturbance was intended. He examined the seams between the planks, noting a fine line of powdery residue, not sawdust, but something older, brittle, and faintly sour. When he brushed it with the back of his hand, the Reverend winced, as though brushing it himself might provoke an apparition. The draught strengthened momentarily, rising like a whispered objection. "Perhaps," Purbright said, "a board might be lifted, purely for inspection." Mrs. Tapping stiffened. "If you feel it is essential." Her tone implied that nothing essential had occurred in Market Lenton since the installation of electric lighting. A local handyman, fetched from the churchyard, where he had been engaged in the dignified burial of autumn leaves under a wheelbarrow, was instructed to remove a single board. His hesitation suggested that he feared quite reasonably that whatever lay beneath would result in paperwork. When the board came loose, a denser breath of stale air exhaled from the gap, carrying with it a faint but unmistakably organic scent. Purbright saw the Reverend's hands clasp involuntarily, as though in liturgical defence. Several committee members took half a step backward, politely, of course, as though withdrawing from a crowded buffet table. The cavity beneath the floor was shallow but shadowed. Purbright leaned closer, his expression retaining its courteous neutrality, even as something pale and vaguely contoured revealed itself beneath a thin layer of dust. It was not immediately identifiable, yet its presence suggested that the draught had been less a meteorological accident and more a discreet signal. "Is it?" the Reverend whispered, throat dry. "An animal?" Purbright gave the question the moment's consideration politeness required. "I believe," he said slowly, "that it is not." Mrs. Tapping inhaled sharply, enough to indicate distress, though not enough to compromise dignity. Purbright motioned for the handyman to widen the opening. The second board came up with a reluctant creak, and a clearer outline emerged. Fabric, fragile and earth-darkened, a wristbone gleaming like a porcelain shard. A collapsed form arranged in what could only be described as unnatural repose. The Reverend swayed. Mrs. Tapping pressed a hand to her chest, though her chief concern appeared to be whether the discovery would necessitate cancelling Thursday's hymn practice. Purbright, after a long moment, stood and dusted his hands mildly. His expression did not alter, but his thoughts shifted with the quiet precision of a drawer closing. "Reverend," he said, "I'm afraid your draft has rather more to say than we anticipated." The vicar blinked several times, each blink a small personal tragedy. "This will cause talk," he murmured. "Undoubtedly," Purbright replied, "though perhaps not the talk any of us expected." As the committee erupted into low-volume exclamations, carefully moderated to avoid theological impropriety, Purbright's gaze drifted toward a small, knotted strip of cloth caught beneath a joist. It seemed unimportant at first glance, yet he felt the faint tug of curiosity it provoked. He reached down, extracted the fragment gently, and folded it into his palm. It was a torn corner of something once sturdy, now brittle with age, but not, he suspected, age enough. He said nothing to the others, who continued negotiating their shock with the practiced civility of people accustomed to denying inconvenient truths. Instead, he slipped the scrap into his coat pocket, feeling the first quiet stirrings of a question that Market Lenton, in its usual fashion, would prefer not to answer. Inspector Purbright returned to St. Mildred's the following morning, not out of impatience, but because Market Lenton's collective propriety demanded that the presence of a police officer be temporally appropriate rather than hurried or conspicuous. The vicar, Reverend Prowse, had requested his attendance at a hastily convened meeting of the church committee, ostensibly to discuss pew repairs, but in practice to ensure that no public scandal was allowed to flourish unchecked. The committee room, a narrow annex smelling faintly of old hymnals and varnish, quickly filled with the town's various representatives, Mrs. Tapping, still in her floral-patterned bonnet, with an expression suggesting one could endure a murder, provided it was properly documented, Mr. Halloway, treasurer, whose spectacles slid perpetually down his nose as though trying to avoid witnessing anything untoward, and Miss Dumble, secretary, armed with a notebook large enough to conceal nervousness. Purbright observed them as they settled into ritualized positions around the long oak table, each movement an unspoken negotiation of hierarchy and civility. He noted, as he always did, the ways in which politeness both concealed and revealed. A cough here, a deliberate pause there, a hand lingering just a moment too long on the edge of the table, each gesture registering as a tentative probe into what the others knew or suspected. "Good morning," he said in his customary measured tone, allowing the room to register both acknowledgement and authority without offence. The vicar, uneasy yet resolute in duty, motioned toward the subject at hand. "It concerns the incident beneath the nave," Prowse began, his voice pitched as if measuring the permissible level of alarm. "It would be prudent, necessary even, to review what transpired and what must be reported." A polite rustle of papers followed. Mrs. Tapping adjusted her bonnet as though to signal that her dignity could accommodate only so much revelation. "I would hope, Reverend," she said carefully, "that nothing here need be exaggerated. The Church has always survived minor inconveniences, and I should imagine this is no different." Her eyes, however, suggested an anxiety she could not entirely disguise, a suspicion that the minor inconvenience in question might involve something more permanent. Purbright allowed a silent moment to pass. "Exaggeration," he said finally, "tends to obscure rather than illuminate. Might we proceed with precise accounts?" One by one, the committee members offered their versions, each more restrained than the last. Halloway spoke of noticing an unusual draught during his rounds, taking care to imply that he had not been disturbed by any unpleasant discoveries. Miss Dumble described the steps she had taken to notify the vicar, noting in passing that she had consulted the relevant historical records, though no records seemed to illuminate anything beyond procedural propriety. Mrs. Tapping contributed only a brief comment on the floorboard's aesthetic condition, which she judged to be adequate, if somewhat unpersuasive. A remark that drew careful nods from her companions, as though agreement could serve as evidence of virtue. Purbright interjected occasionally, not with accusation, but with quiet clarification, noting discrepancies between the recollections. Some were minor, the time of arrival, the sequence of footsteps, but others suggested more substantive omissions. One might have expected these to provoke defensive responses. Instead, they prompted silence, a shared understanding that social cohesion, though fraying, must not be entirely forsaken. As the discussion proceeded, the inspector's attention shifted to more subtle indicators, the angle of a glance, the micro-expression of restraint when a name was mentioned, the way hands gripped notes more tightly when certain subjects arose. It was evident that several of the committee had vested interests, though none would articulate them outright. Reputation in Market Lenton was as fragile as the antique pews, and far more difficult to repair once damaged. Midway through the meeting, a minor revelation occurred. A ledger previously considered routine had been altered. Miss Dumble hesitated before admitting that certain notations had been amended after consultation with Halloway. The phrasing was meticulous, clerical errors corrected in good faith. Purbright detected, however, that good faith was carefully chosen to imply intent while avoiding any outright admission of culpability. The room's tension remained invisible, polite, yet unmistakable, like the faint tremor of a bell just beyond the hearing threshold. The conversation shifted delicately to the parish volunteer, Edgar Blay, whose absence was still unexplained. Halloway noted that Blay had taken a sudden leave for personal matters, an assertion repeated by several others in unison, as though synchrony lent veracity. Purbright's eyes, however, lingered on the small contradictions, the dates that overlapped, the implied familiarity with repairs that Blay had reportedly neglected, and the curious absence of corroboration from anyone outside the committee. By the time the meeting concluded, no definitive explanation had emerged. The committee agreed to keep the incident discreet, phrasing it as a minor structural oversight while avoiding direct reference to what lay beneath the floorboards. They adjourned with the ceremonious caution of diplomats, each member adjusting hats, gloves, or spectacles with careful deliberation. Purbright remained behind for a moment, watching the committee depart. He picked up the ledger Halloway had left open, noting the faint indentation of pen strokes beneath the ink, evidence that someone had written, erased, and rewritten passages with the utmost care. He replaced it as he found it, silently cataloguing the subtleties, procedural obfuscation, controlled disclosures, and the curious alignment of social loyalty with selective amnesia. As he stepped from the committee room into the crisp morning air, Purbright's attention lingered on a minor detail, overlooked by the others. A single footprint in the dust at the base of the lectern, small, neat, and almost apologetic, suggesting that someone had been present beneath the nave after all. He folded his coat collar against the wind, mindful that the quiet question it raised might yet unravel the carefully orchestrated appearances of Market Lenton. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage shortly after breakfast, noting that Market Lenton had assumed its usual decorum, as if the previous day's revelation beneath the nave had been a mere seasonal draught. Reverend Prowse, though outwardly composed, betrayed slight tension in the set of his jaw and the careful arrangement of his waistcoat. The vicar greeted Purbright with an almost imperceptible nod, as though they both understood that politeness was now an instrument of investigation rather than mere habit. "The committee," Prowse began, his voice pitched, in the modestly elevated register reserved for sensitive disclosures, "has expressed concern regarding the absence of Mr. Edgar Blay. His sudden disappearance is, shall we say, inconveniently timed." Purbright inclined his head, letting the vicar speak further before offering comment. "Inconvenient," he repeated softly, the single word conveying both literal understanding and quiet appraisal of its euphemistic elegance. The vicar explained that Blay, a volunteer of some repute, had been responsible for minor maintenance tasks throughout the church, particularly those requiring discreet attention. He had been last seen during the week before the draught beneath the nave had become apparent, and no member of the parish seemed able to provide more than fragmentary details of his movements. Purbright noted the careful hedging in each account, as though the committee's collective memory had been arranged to preserve both civility and reputation. "I have corresponded with several of his acquaintances," Prowse continued, "but none have any knowledge of his intended absence. Naturally, we wish to avoid undue alarm among parishioners." "Alarm," Purbright remarked, "is relative to the expectations of those who receive it. I suspect Market Lenton might be more alarmed by gossip than by actual events." His observation drew no outward acknowledgement, though the vicar's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the writing desk. The inspector spent a considerable interval reviewing parish records, noting the meticulous sequence of Blay's reported activities. There were ledger entries for minor repairs, annotations regarding lighting fixtures, and the occasional note concerning the movement of hymnals, all carefully detailed. Yet the intervals between entries suggested that Blay had operated unobserved at certain hours, a pattern unusual for someone so scrupulously attentive. Purbright's scrutiny revealed subtle inconsistencies, an extra line in the repair log here, a slightly misdated note there. None were egregious, but all warranted quiet attention. Miss Dumble, summoned for clarification, demonstrated the peculiar politeness of one who fears both reproach and self-incrimination. She recounted Blay's last known tasks with a precision that seemed rehearsed, enumerating each chore without any indication of deviation or personal observation. Purbright noticed the slight tremor of her hand as she turned a page of her notebook, an almost imperceptible sign that some truth had been carefully circumscribed. Mrs. Tapping, as always concerned with appearances, commented on Blay's virtues in language so deliberately polished that it suggested more than admiration. "He was diligent," she said, "and yet unassuming. Market Lenton relied upon his discretion." Her eyes flickered toward the vicar with the faintest hint of a question, as if seeking tacit permission to continue, yet refraining from overt elaboration. Purbright allowed the remark to settle, then posed the question with formal tact. "Were there any recent disagreements or expressions of dissatisfaction involving Mr. Blay?" A pause ensued. Halloway adjusted his spectacles, glancing at his notes with careful detachment. "Minor misunderstandings," he said finally, concerning scheduling and allocation of duties. Nothing substantial, I assure you. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible hesitation. In Market Lenton, minor misunderstandings often bore a weight far greater than the words implied. The language of understatement was the town's preferred instrument of concealment, and he had learned to interpret it with precision. When asked about Blai's personal habits, the committee members provided nothing beyond routine civility, a penchant for punctuality, an interest in local history, and a singular fastidiousness regarding his tools. There were no accounts of friends outside the parish, no letters mentioned, no hints of travel. Each answer seemed to tighten the circle of suspicion, not by revelation, but by the deliberate absence of information. Purbright wandered through the parish grounds, observing the small cottages and carefully maintained gardens. His attention lingered on the seemingly inconsequential, a shutter slightly ajar, footprints in dusted paths, a gate hinge lightly oiled but recently disturbed. Each offered subtle testimony to activity not yet acknowledged, a pattern of presence and absence that suggested Blai's movements had not been as private or as unnoticed as the committee implied. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright examined a ledger left open on the writing desk. There, in a corner of the page, was a notation partially erased, yet the indentation beneath the ink betrayed its existence. The word appeared to be a name, faint but deliberate, suggesting that someone had wished to record Blai's last interactions while obscuring the identity of those involved. Purbright replaced the ledger, considering the implication. The absence of Mr. Blai, combined with careful omissions, half-formed memories, and polite deflection, suggested that the volunteer's disappearance might intersect with the recent events beneath the nave. Yet there was no urgency in the scene, only the slow, deliberate motion of civility and avoidance. As he stepped into the morning light, Purbright's gaze lingered on a faint impression in the garden soil, a shoe print, small and neat, partially washed by dew, leading neither directly toward the street nor into the church. Its direction implied purpose, not accident. For a moment, the inspector allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of noticing a question that Market Lenton might prefer to remain unanswered. Where, precisely, had Edgar Blai gone, and who, in the town's careful choreography, might know the answer? The morning air in Market Lenton carried the faint scent of damp earth and newly printed parish newsletters, though the usual hum of gossip had not yet begun. Inspector Purbright, making his customary measured approach to the vicarage, noted the careful arrangement of hedges and footpaths, each blade of grass seemingly aligned with civic propriety. The Reverend Prowse, already pacing in the narrow hallway, welcomed him with an expression of courteous alarm, the sort that suggested one wished both to reveal and conceal simultaneously. "I fear," the vicar began, "that the absence of Mr. Edgar Blai has complicated matters beyond mere inconvenience." He gestured toward a small wooden table where a ledger lay open, its pages immaculate, except for a few faintly smudged annotations. "The committee has, naturally, attempted to account for all entries, but I confess some irregularities have emerged." Purbright inclined his head. "Irregularities?" he repeated, allowing the word to settle with its understated weight. The vicar, sensing the inspector's deliberate patience, continued without interruption. "Yes, certain entries relating to donations and repairs appear to have been amended. The handwriting is at first glance consistent, but I cannot account for all revisions." His fingers hovered delicately above the ledger, as if it were a relic that might betray him if handled too firmly. Purbright examined the pages with formal care, noting the subtle discrepancies in ink and indentation. Several corrections had been made post facto, not entirely aligned with the original script. Some lines bore the trace of erasure, faint enough to suggest deliberate concealment rather than accident. He allowed his gaze to linger on a marginal note, partially obscured, a name written, erased, and written again, leaving only a shadow of intent. "Do you know who made these amendments?" he asked quietly, his tone neutral but precise. The vicar shook his head. "It would be improper to speculate. The committee's aim has always been the preservation of order." He pronounced the last word as though it were a benediction, though Purbright detected the anxiety beneath the carefully chosen cadence. Miss Dumble arrived shortly after, clutching her notebook as though it contained the town's moral compass. She offered her account of the ledger's use with meticulous attention, describing Blais's routine inspections and noting the ostensibly minor discrepancies she had observed. Each statement was couched in cautious phrasing. "It may be that," or "I believe the intention was," deliberate hedges against commitment. Purbright observed the subtle tension in her posture, a mild tremor that suggested knowledge just beyond her civility. Mrs. Tapping appeared soon after, her bonnet adjusted with precise deliberation, and added her own commentary on the volunteer's habits. "Edgar was conscientious and yet discreet," she said, her gaze flicking toward the ledger with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Market Lenton relied upon him, and I dare say we have all benefited from his discretion." She paused, as if expecting an unspoken question, and then continued in deliberately neutral tones. Purbright allowed them to speak without interruption, quietly compiling observations from the intersecting silences. He noted that every committee member employed a form of linguistic precision designed to safeguard both their personal reputations and the town's collective image. Even the vicar, a man of considerable patience, seemed caught in the subtle net of social expectation, aware that any misstep could be interpreted as negligence. Turning his attention back to the ledger, Purbright traced the faint impressions beneath the ink. One name, partially obliterated, recurred in different handwriting, suggesting either multiple authors or posthumous correction. He considered the implications. A small conspiracy of propriety, perhaps, with the intention of preserving appearances while quietly manipulating reality. The vicar's voice interrupted the silence. "I have been asked," he said carefully, "whether these revisions might concern financial oversight. I have replied that any suggestion of impropriety would be premature." The final word, though innocuous, bore the weight of social caution, implying both recognition and denial. Purbright allowed a moment of measured observation. "Premature," he repeated, "is a convenient term, one that protects the present while postponing scrutiny of the past." He closed the ledger gently, as though preserving it from the effects of inadvertent candor. Miss Dumble hesitated at the doorway, her expression both deferential and uneasy. "Inspector," she said, "I must admit there were conversations regarding Mr. Blais's recent observations, though we considered them private." She paused, glancing at the vicar, who inclined his head in subtle approval, signalling discretion rather than censure. "What sort of observations?" Purbright inquired, his voice even, almost disinterested. She replied cautiously, "He noticed discrepancies, small ones, I believe, in recording donations, but he did not report them formally. Perhaps he wished to resolve them quietly." Her eyes sought reassurance. Her tone suggested both innocence and a hint of unacknowledged knowledge. Purbright noted the careful ambiguity. The information implied motive, yet remained insulated by propriety. The ledger, the subtle erasures, the whispered references, all hinted at oversight and potential concealment without requiring outright acknowledgement. As he stepped back into the garden, Purbright's attention lingered on a solitary slip of paper protruding from the ledger's spine. It bore a faint smudge of ink, almost imperceptible, yet suggestive of hurried annotation. He pocketed it quietly, recognizing that it might prove more telling than any verbal admission. Market Lenton, in its meticulous maintenance of civility, had inadvertently left a fragment of truth exposed. Purbright paused on the path, noting a faint indentation in the soft earth near the rear gate, a mark so slight that it would likely escape notice, yet precise enough to suggest that someone had recently moved about with purpose. He considered the combination of ledger anomalies and subtle traces, realizing that Blai's absence and the committee's revisions might not be coincidental, but rather two aspects of a carefully managed secret. For a moment he allowed the question to hang in the morning air, unspoken but insistent. Who had taken measures to shape the ledger, and for what purpose? The day began, as many did in Market Lenton, with the town's usual whisper of civility, curtains drawn in symmetrical folds, hedges clipped to near-identical heights, and shopkeepers greeting one another with the practiced neutrality of diplomats. Inspector Purbright, walking toward the vicarage, noted the subtle rhythms of the town's social machinery. A disturbance in the regular cadence, such as the revelation beneath St. Mildred's nave, left a residual tension invisible, yet tangible, an atmosphere that hung over conversations and gestures alike. Reverend Prowse awaited him in the drawing-room, papers neatly stacked, a teacup balanced precariously at the edge of the small mahogany table. "I trust the morning finds you well," the vicar said, though his eyes betrayed a mild concern. "There have been developments of a minor but notable character regarding Mr. Edgar Blai." Purbright inclined his head, acknowledging the understated gravity. "Minor but notable," he repeated, the phrasing indicative of Market Lenton's preferred restraint. Prowse explained that several parish members had been observed exchanging furtive glances, lingering over ledger entries and altering minor notations under the guise of routine oversight. These subtleties were, in their own quiet way, a testament to the town's collective anxiety. "They wish, of course, to preserve appearances," the vicar continued, while ensuring that no gossip might diminish the parish's standing. His hands clasped tightly around the cup suggested that even spiritual authority could not wholly insulate him from social pressure. Purbright spent the next hour reviewing various notes, observing patterns and slight deviations in handwriting. The ledger, he discerned, had become more than a record. It had transformed into an instrument of social negotiation, mediating between public virtue and private concern. Miss Dumble, summoned once more, described revisions made to entries as clarifications, though she allowed that the changes might have been influenced by other parties. Her phrasing was cautious, accurate enough to convey fact, but hedged to avoid implication. Mrs. Tapping arrived shortly afterward, her floral bonnet adjusted with meticulous precision. "Inspector," she said, "I trust we can agree that nothing in this parish should be allowed to reflect poorly upon our good name. Mr. Blai's absence is regrettable, yet I feel it is best approached with decorum rather than speculation." Her words carried the dual weight of reassurance and admonition. Civility in Market Lenton was often wielded as both shield and subtle censure. Purbright allowed her comments to settle, then inquired about the minor inconsistencies she had noticed. Tapping hesitated, then remarked that Blai had, on occasion, questioned certain allocations of funds, though she added swiftly that such observations were purely administrative and in no way suggestive of impropriety. Purbright recognized this as a careful, preemptive framing, designed to acknowledge facts while restraining moral anxiety from spilling over into accusation. The inspector next reviewed a series of letters stored in the parish archives, each bearing the polite language of routine correspondence, but punctuated by moments of pointed ambiguity. A note from Halloway to Blay contained a carefully underlined phrase: "Attention to minor discrepancies requested." The phrasing, ostensibly neutral, hinted at concern without revealing the depth of unease. Purbright traced the emphasis with a fingertip, noting the subtlety with which Market Lenton masked unease in ritualized formality. Later, while walking along the gravel path behind the vicarage, Purbright observed the interplay of small signals among parishioners performing their morning chores. A glance held too long, a deliberate clearing of the throat, and the precise adjustment of a bonnet all functioned as markers of attention and perhaps mild reproach. Such deviations from habitual behaviour were rarely accidental. In Market Lenton, propriety was a mechanism of both reassurance and silent surveillance. Back at the church, Purbright inspected the floorboards once more. The section that had revealed the draft now bore a faint smear of dust suggesting recent movement. Not hurried, not violent, but deliberate enough to indicate that someone had returned after the initial discovery. The trace was minor, easily overlooked by those focused on ceremonial appearances. But to Purbright it spoke volumes, a controlled presence, careful and quiet, avoiding attention yet leaving a signature for those who observed closely. Miss Dumble, summoned to assist with cataloguing minor repairs, mentioned casually that Blay had once hinted at intending to reconcile discrepancies he had noticed with the committee's records. She spoke of it in a measured tone, as though the statement were both insignificant and impossible to ignore. Purbright noted that the wording suggested more than intent. It implied a potential confrontation, a reconciliation that might have unsettled the delicate equilibrium of the parish. As the afternoon sun cast precise angles through the clerestory, Purbright gathered his observations, the ledger's alterations, the committee's measured anxieties, the subtle traces of movement beneath the nave. Each element, individually inconsequential, formed a lattice of controlled social behaviour designed to maintain appearances. Yet amid the careful orchestration, a single footprint in the dust suggested deviation, a minor act, unobserved by the committee, hinting at presence beyond their scrutiny. Purbright allowed the discovery to register without comment. The town would continue its rituals of civility, yet beneath that surface, something, small, precise and deliberate, had altered the pattern. He made a mental note of the footprint's dimensions and orientation, aware that in Market Lenton, even the smallest deviation from expectation could prove significant. As he left the churchyard, the quiet question lingered, unspoken but insistent. Who had moved beneath the nave after all, and with what quiet purpose? Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall in the mid-morning, noting that the building's windows reflected the day's muted sunlight with the indifferent precision of Market Lenton itself. A gathering of parish committee members had been arranged, ostensibly to discuss routine preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. In practice, the meeting served as a forum for unspoken anxieties regarding the recent events beneath the nave and the still unexplained absence of Mr. Edgar Blay. The chairs, arranged in a rigid semicircle, allowed every attendee to observe the others without overt intrusion, a spatial etiquette suited to subtle social manoeuvring. Reverend Prowse, already present, greeted Purbright with the mild formality reserved for officers of the law whose visits were expected but still slightly inconvenient. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "I trust your observations yesterday have not caused undue distress." The phrase, carefully balanced, implied both reassurance and gentle expectation. Distress was acceptable only to the extent that it did not disturb appearances. The committee members took their seats with varying degrees of stiffness. Mrs. Tapping, her bonnet adjusted with precision, offered a brief nod. Halloway, spectacles sliding slightly down his nose, tapped the ledger with a measured insistence. Miss Dumble held her notebook to her chest as if it were a talisman against moral ambiguity. Purbright's gaze travelled across them, noting the subtle choreography of civility, each gesture a delicate assertion of propriety and influence. Prowse opened the discussion. "We have convened today," he said, "to review minor administrative matters. However, in light of recent events, it seems prudent to consider ancillary observations, particularly those noted by Mr. Blay." He hesitated, carefully measuring the committee's reaction. The pause, though brief, allowed a silent acknowledgement of absence. Blay's disappearance had introduced a tension that the parish could neither ignore nor articulate outright. Mrs. Tapping spoke first, her voice as calm as a measured breeze. Edgar, though reliable, did possess tendencies to scrutinize, perhaps more rigorously than necessary. One must appreciate the value of discretion, even when one believes it unheeded. Her phrasing suggested admonition without accusation, a subtle reminder that moral oversight could coexist with social diplomacy. Halloway adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed," he said, "observations must be balanced against precedent. There are limits to which minutiae should dictate committee decisions. While I acknowledge Mr. Blay's diligence, we must weigh it carefully." The implication was clear. Diligence was commendable only within socially acceptable bounds. Miss Dumble, noting the direction of conversation, offered her account of Blay's conduct, again emphasizing careful neutrality. He noticed certain entries, minor inconsistencies perhaps, but his intention was to maintain accuracy rather than to imply impropriety. Her phrasing was precise, yet the slight tremor of her hand hinted at withheld detail. Purbright catalogued the nuance. Civility had become a mask, while hesitation indicated concealed information. Purbright inquired gently whether any correspondence or personal notes from Blay had been found. The question was phrased neutrally, as if the answer were trivial. Miss Dumble produced a small packet of folded papers, each bearing familiar administrative language, but with underlined words that suggested emphasis beyond the explicit content. Purbright examined the handwriting. Precise, careful, yet occasionally overwritten, a subtle sign of deliberate reconsideration. Reverend Prowse, conscious of decorum, intervened. "These notes were meant to clarify, not to alarm," he said. "Market Lenton thrives on order, and any suggestion of discord must be framed judiciously." His careful phrasing betrayed the town's collective anxiety. Civility was protective, yet fragile when confronted with inconvenient truths. Purbright's attention, however, lingered on the intersections of these statements. The notes, the ledger, and Blay's absence formed a lattice of deliberate omissions and understated suggestions. The committee members, in their politeness, provided only partial illumination, each emphasizing propriety while indirectly revealing unease. Small hesitations, micro-expressions of doubt, and the occasional misalignment of body language supplied more insight than any spoken word. During a pause, Purbright noted a faint smudge on the underside of the table, an overlooked fingerprint suggesting recent contact. Neither Mrs. Tapping nor Halloway acknowledged it. The motion had been almost imperceptible, yet precise enough to indicate movement beneath the guise of routine activity. A subtle proof, perhaps, of an unobserved presence that intersected with Blay's disappearance. As the meeting adjourned, the committee members departed with measured civility, adjusting gloves, hats, or spectacles, as though these gestures alone could realign the parish's moral equilibrium. Purbright lingered, examining the notes once more. One phrase, underlined and partially erased, suggested an intention to record an observation while obscuring the observer's identity. It was minor, almost insignificant, yet it whispered of careful planning, restrained action, and the possibility that Blai's absence was part of a deliberate design rather than mere happenstance. Stepping into the hall's sunlight, Purbright noticed a small indentation in the floor near the rear exit, faint but distinct. Its orientation suggested purposeful movement away from the committee's attention, yet toward some unseen objective. He traced it with a subtle mental annotation. The footprint's existence implied that someone had operated beyond the scrutiny of both parish protocol and social expectation. Purbright left the hall with a quiet impression. Civility, in Market Lenton, was both a shield and a lens. Beneath it, patterns of discretion, hesitation, and minor deception unfolded like a muted code. The footprint, the erased note, and Blai's absence formed a delicate triangulation, evidence unspoken, yet insistent. For a moment he allowed the question to hover. Who had moved beyond observation, and what subtle design might guide those movements beneath the town's carefully maintained propriety? Inspector Purbright elected to make his rounds mid-afternoon, a choice guided less by urgency than by the tacit understanding that Market Lenton's social rhythms dictated the timing of both disclosure and concealment. The streets were still, save for the occasional clatter of a bicycle wheel over cobblestones and the measured steps of townsfolk conducting errands with the practiced grace of habitual surveillance. Purbright's own steps were careful, his attention divided between the facades of cottages and the subtler cues of human behaviour. A glance held just long enough to convey suspicion, a gesture of polite adjustment hinting at inward unease. He paused at the home of Mrs. Tapping, whose porch bore evidence of diligent, sweeping, yet subtle signs of recent disturbance. Displaced leaves, a smudge upon the threshold. The inspector's knock was answered promptly, her floral bonnet slightly tilted, eyes reflecting mild surprise at an unexpected visit. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head with carefully measured civility, "I trust your day is proceeding smoothly?" Her phrasing suggested a polite inquiry, yet contained an unspoken caveat. Every question in Market Lenton bore potential implication. Purbright's response was deliberate. "As smoothly as circumstances permit, I wish to clarify a few matters regarding Mr. Blai's recent activities and the ledger entries discussed yesterday." His tone, formal yet unobtrusive, allowed Mrs. Tapping the space to offer information without pressure, preserving the town's equilibrium of politeness. She gestured him inside, and they settled near a window that filtered the afternoon sun into precise rectangles on the carpet. Mrs. Tapping spoke of Blai's conscientious habits, emphasizing punctuality, diligence, and discretion, all virtues the town cherished. Yet her phrasing contained subtle hedges. "He had been attentive to certain details," she said, her eyes flicking momentarily to a corner of the room where a ledger lay among correspondence. Purbright noted the hesitation, a minor clue in a pattern of carefully restrained revelation. A casual reference to a recent parish meeting elicited a faint tightening of her hands around her teacup. She spoke of discussions regarding floorboards and donations with careful neutrality, yet allowed that Blai had occasionally expressed minor concerns about inconsistencies, concerns that, she emphasized, were purely administrative and meant for private resolution. Purbright catalogued her phrasing, civility preserved, responsibility deflected, anxiety hinted at through subtle emphasis rather than explicit statement. Halloway's residence was next. The treasurer welcomed Purbright with a precise nod, spectacles perched on the nose in the habitual slide that betrayed nervousness. Under scrutiny, ledger sheets lay open on the sideboard, and Halloway, with meticulous care, tapped on particular entries as though each motion reinforced the town's moral rectitude. "I assure you," he said, "any alterations are strictly clerical." Mr. Blais's oversight, though diligent, occasionally necessitated minor amendments. Nothing untoward, I assure you. His repeated assurances were smooth but perfunctory, and the slight hesitation before "nothing untoward" suggested awareness of potential misperception. Purbright's inquiries concerned not the amendments themselves, but the context of their timing and purpose. Halloway replied with precision, recounting conversations that had occurred in the presence of Miss Dumble or Blais himself. Each statement was couched in conditional phrasing. "I believe," "it may be," "one assumes," a web of careful neutrality masking the potential for unspoken knowledge. At both visits, Purbright noticed faint signs: a scuff upon a floorboard, a smudge on a windowsill, an indentation in a carpet corner. Minor traces easily overlooked, suggesting movement or handling just beyond public observation. Each alone was insignificant. Together they formed a pattern hinting at the same deliberate precision he had observed in the church. Returning toward the vicarage, Purbright paused to note a window slightly ajar in an otherwise locked property. The angle of light revealed a shadow that shifted subtly as he watched, suggesting recent activity. He refrained from intrusion, cataloguing the clue mentally. The town's rhythm allowed for appearances, yet beneath them small deviations persisted, imperceptible yet meaningful. Later, seated in the vicarage drawing-room, he reviewed the ledger once more. Marginal annotations, partially erased but faintly indented, hinted at interactions between Blais and unidentified parties. Each erasure, each careful alteration, suggested deliberate concealment, not of criminality per se, but of knowledge that, if revealed, might disrupt reputations or social order. Market Lenton thrived on civility, yet the ledger's quiet anomalies indicated that even the most punctilious facade could not entirely suppress human curiosity and intervention. Purbright allowed his attention to drift momentarily to the garden outside, where a slight depression in the soil suggested recent movement. Its presence confirmed the subtle traces observed earlier, implying a deliberate pattern of activity extending beyond the immediate oversight of the committee. A question, quiet and insistent, formed. Who had navigated these spaces so precisely, and for what discrete purpose? The town's reputation, carefully maintained, was an active participant in the mystery, concealing yet revealing in the same subtle measure. As the sun waned, Purbright prepared to leave, cataloguing mental notes for subsequent visits. The day had revealed little in the way of explicit fact, yet the accumulation of small traces, smudges, footprints, hesitation, carefully chosen words, provided the beginnings of a map of intention and presence. He stepped into the crisp afternoon air, aware that beneath Market Lenton's veneer of civility, the threads of secrecy were weaving patterns far more deliberate than the town's outward calm suggested. The late afternoon in Market Lenton carried the subtle coolness of early autumn, the sun low enough to cast long shadows through narrow streets, while leaving facades carefully illuminated in polite brightness. Inspector Purbright made his measured way to the vicarage, noting the absence of usual pedestrian traffic. The town's rhythm had been temporarily altered by concern over Mr. Blais's disappearance and the enigmatic annotations now circulating within the parish ledger. Even the familiar clatter of the baker's tray had been reduced to a faintly apprehensive murmur. Reverend Prowse received him in the drawing-room, already perched near the ledger, which lay open atop a mahogany desk. "Inspector," he said, his tone precisely neutral yet tinged with subdued anxiety, "I have taken the liberty of reviewing the ledger once more. Certain marginal notes remain ambiguous and the committee seems hesitant to elaborate." His hands, clasped over a cup of tea, betrayed a momentary tremor, suggesting that propriety alone could not entirely contain concern. Purbright inclined his head. "Hesitation," he remarked. is a language as eloquent as speech, particularly in Market Lenton. He allowed the words to rest, letting their understated weight guide the vicar toward further exposition. Prowse explained that Blai's absence had left the committee navigating minor irregularities without the volunteers' usual guidance. Each alteration to the ledger, whether erasure, overwriting, or annotation, had been carefully justified in procedural language, yet all bore subtle discrepancies in ink pressure and marginal spacing. Purbright examined these, noting the near imperceptible differences between the handwriting of committee members, each variation functioning as an unintentional signature of presence and intent. Miss Dumble arrived shortly after, her notebook clasped firmly to her chest. She recounted the minor revisions Blai had flagged before his disappearance. A slightly misdated entry concerning donations, a marginal correction of a floorboard repair, and annotations regarding cleaning schedules. Each had been addressed with deliberate attention by different committee members, yet none revealed the rationale behind their adjustments. The careful neutrality of her account betrayed more than it stated. Hesitation suggested that some details were deliberately withheld, preserved beneath layers of politeness. Mrs. Tapping appeared not long afterward, offering a measured assessment of the ledger's state. The records, though precise, have necessitated minor intervention, she said, her voice formal, but edged with a subtle tension. It is, I think, fortunate that Mr. Blai's discretion precluded public awareness. Market Lenton thrives upon order, and I would regret any perception of impropriety. Her choice of words, while superficially commendatory, implied that deviations from routine, even minor, carried potential social risk. Purbright allowed the observations to accumulate, noting the intricate web of subtle indications, erasures that hinted at reconsideration, annotations that suggested awareness without disclosure, and deliberate hesitations in speech. The ledger, he discerned, was less a record than a medium of social negotiation, balancing the town's expectations of civility with the quiet necessity of administrative oversight. He inspected a particular annotation near the ledger's rear, a name faintly erased, almost imperceptible beneath subsequent ink. The indentation suggested deliberate overwriting, and the partial obscurity implied an intention to record while simultaneously concealing. Purbright recognized the strategy, a minor act of discretion designed to preserve appearances while allowing for private observation. As he traced these signs, a soft knock at the door introduced another layer of social nuance. A local parishioner, Mrs. Tyndall, entered, bearing a small parcel. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if to demonstrate both deference and unobtrusive purpose. She mentioned, in carefully neutral tones, that she had seen Blai the day before his disappearance, attending to ledger entries with his habitual diligence. Nothing in her manner suggested alarm, yet the indirect phrasing, attending to ledger entries, implied awareness of some concern left unspoken. Purbright considered her report alongside the physical evidence, the faint smudge on the ledger, the indentation of erased text, and subtle variations in ink. Each element alone might be inconsequential, yet together they hinted at patterns of presence, oversight, and deliberate concealment. The town's obsession with propriety had produced a lattice in which small anomalies, footprints, smudges, hesitation, functioned as whispers of unrecorded activity. Later in the garden he noted a narrow track in the dewy grass, partially obscured by fallen leaves. The indentation was shallow but continuous, suggesting passage from the rear of the vicarage toward the church. Its precision indicated careful movement. It was not the erratic imprint of casual wandering, but the deliberate signature of someone conscious of observation and consequences. As evening light softened the outlines of hedges and rooftops, Purbright allowed the pattern to form in his mind. Ledger alterations, committee hesitation, faint traces of movement. Each component alone was easily dismissed, yet collectively they suggested intentionality. Someone, it seemed, had traversed these spaces with purpose, recording and correcting, yet leaving a trail so subtle that only the most attentive observer might perceive it. Stepping back inside, Purbright's gaze lingered on the partially erased note. The combination of ink pressure, marginal alignment, and faint impression indicated a silent dialogue between Blay and the committee, a conversation of presence and oversight conducted entirely through gesture and annotation. For a moment he allowed a quiet question to linger, unspoken but insistent. Who had controlled the ledger's narrative, and to what end had these small deviations been orchestrated? The twilight of Market Lenton settled with an unremarkable civility, shadows elongating along the narrow streets and the occasional lantern casting deliberate pools of light. Inspector Purbright, walking at his customary measured pace, reflected that the town's rhythm seemed even more meticulous since the subtle revelations concerning the ledger and Mr. Blay's absence. In Market Lenton, civility itself acted as both surveillance and restraint. Each gesture, glance, or hesitation carried a weight that could not be ignored by a careful observer. Arriving at the vicarage, Purbright was greeted by Reverend Prowse, who bore the polite composure of a man attempting to conceal anticipatory tension. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "I trust your investigations have proceeded without disturbance." The phrasing implied an unspoken expectation. Market Lenton tolerated inquiry only within measured boundaries, and any disruption to social equanimity was unwelcome. Purbright, without comment, moved to examine the ledger once more. The entries, revisions, and faintly smudged notations suggested a subtle evolution. Marginal notes now exhibited slight differences in pressure and orientation, implying multiple hands or post hoc correction. Prowse observed him silently, allowing the inspector's scrutiny to proceed without interruption, understanding the unspoken negotiation between attention and discretion. Miss Dumble arrived shortly after, her notebook carried with the habitual carefulness of a talisman. She spoke in the restrained tones characteristic of Market Lenton, recounting her observations of Blay's routine and minor ledger corrections. Each account was framed to preserve civility. It may be that, or one presumes, were prefatory markers, hedging statements to allow for uncertainty while simultaneously hinting at knowledge withheld. Purbright noted the delicacy. Even minor hesitation could convey more than direct statement, a currency of discretion traded in glances and qualified assertions. Later, a soft knock announced the presence of a visitor previously unanticipated, Mr. Halloway, the treasurer, bearing additional ledger sheets. His arrival was conducted with careful formality. His shoes made deliberate contact with the carpet, a measured rhythm that suggested neither urgency nor indifference. He offered his explanations with punctilious neutrality, emphasizing that all corrections had been entirely administrative and insisting on the propriety of prior procedures. Yet subtle tells, slight misalignment of spectacles, repeated clearing of the throat betrayed the anxiety of one conscious of observation and potential scrutiny. Purbright listened, noting that Halloway's meticulousness was both shield and confession. The gentleman's adherence to ritualized formality contrasted with minor physical slips, fingerprints on ledger edges, slight smudges, and a small crease in one sheet, suggesting hurried handling. These deviations were, in Market Lenton, minor yet meaningful. They suggested deliberate yet cautious intervention. As the conversation continued, the inspector's attention shifted to the room's peripheries, a faint footprint in the carpet's edge, nearly erased by passing movement, a soft indentation on the writing desk where papers had been recently displaced. Purbright catalogued these silent traces, recognizing a pattern of deliberate yet discreet activity. Movement in Market Lenton was rarely unobserved, and when unnoticed, it spoke volumes of purpose and calculation. Miss Dumble, noting his scrutiny, ventured a careful comment regarding Blaise's habit of annotating the ledger with minute observations, often revisiting entries to ensure conformity to administrative and social norms. He sought, I believe, she said, to maintain order without disturbing reputations. The phrasing allowed Purbright to perceive intention. The preservation of civility often required delicate negotiation between disclosure and concealment, and Blaise's diligence had subtly exposed tensions without ever openly confronting them. Later, alone with the ledger, Purbright observed a partially erased name, faint and nearly imperceptible beneath the ink of subsequent corrections. Its recurrence suggested deliberate alteration, a silent dialogue between the absent Blaise and those who sought to maintain appearances. Such careful manipulation indicated consciousness of both observation and consequence, the quiet architecture of propriety intersecting with unrecorded intent. Stepping toward the window, Purbright noticed a narrow indentation in the soft earth outside, partially covered by fallen leaves. Its direction suggested a discreet passage from the rear garden toward the churchyard. Though shallow, the trace was intentional. Someone had traversed the space with awareness of scrutiny, leaving a mark imperceptible to casual attention, yet significant to an observer attuned to subtleties. The evening light waned, leaving the vicarage cloaked in soft shadow. Purbright considered the day's accumulations, ledger anomalies, cautious remarks, subtle physical traces, and the deliberate hesitations of those surrounding the absent Blaise. The pattern was coherent, yet frustratingly incomplete. The town's outward civility concealed minor deviations that hinted at purposeful activity beneath the surface. He catalogued each observation, aware that even minor evidence, fingerprints, smudges, erasures, footmarks, was a language Market Lenton had perfected to communicate intentions while preserving appearances. As he stepped toward the door, the quiet question remained, lingering like the final note of a carefully rehearsed cadence. Who had moved deliberately through these spaces, and for what discrete purpose had the ledger, the committee, and the absent Blaise been orchestrated into this understated choreography of civility and concealment? The morning in Market Lenton dawned with the measured calm of habitual civility. Windows polished to near identical clarity, hedges clipped with geometrical precision, and the faint aroma of baking drifting from the high street. Inspector Purbright, stepping along the cobbled streets toward the church, noted that even the air seemed ordered, as though the town itself maintained a conscious decorum to guard against disruption. The recent ledger anomalies and Mr. Blaise's absence had cast a gentle shadow over the town, visible in the extra care with which curtains were drawn and greetings exchanged. At the vicarage, Reverend Prowse received him with careful composure, fingers folded neatly upon the mahogany desk. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "I trust your observations yesterday have yielded insight. The committee remains, as ever, steadfast in propriety, though their hesitations are, understandably, heightened." The phrase, meticulously neutral, suggested both acknowledgement and the delicate negotiation of social tension. Propriety was paramount, yet anxiety could not be wholly suppressed. Purbright responded with his customary understatement. "Insight, perhaps, is less a matter of discovery than of attentive observation," he said, gesturing toward the ledger resting nearby. "One notes the deviations, however minor, and the subtle indications of intent that the town's civility sometimes conceals." His tone was quiet but precise. Market Lenton's equilibrium depended on such subtleties being both perceived and unspoken. Miss Dumble arrived with her notebook, offering a detailed accounting of Blaise's prior routine and the marginal ledger corrections she had catalogued over the preceding days. She noted, in careful phrasing, the multiple revisions performed by committee members after Blai's observations. Each amendment had been necessary for clarity, while leaving the original intention discernible beneath faint erasures. Purbright noted the implicit tension. Civility demanded transparency in appearance, even while actual knowledge remained partly obscured. Mrs. Tapping followed, her bonnet perfectly adjusted, her voice formal, yet tinged with the faintest anxiety. "The ledger," she said, "though precise, has required minor interventions. It is fortunate indeed that Mr. Blai maintained discretion. Market Lenton's reputation must be preserved above all else." She paused, allowing the statement to resonate. Even in ostensibly trivial commentary, the town's inhabitants balanced acknowledgement with careful omission. Propriety was a protective measure as well as a social weapon. Purbright examined the ledger closely, noting the subtle underlining, erased annotations, and slight variations in ink pressure. Each mark suggested intention, deliberation, and observation. He traced his finger over a faint indentation, realizing that the corrections formed a silent dialogue between Blai and those who had followed in his administrative footsteps. In Market Lenton, the ledger served not merely as record but as instrument, a tool for negotiating civility, hierarchy, and oversight. A knock at the door announced Halloway, who entered with habitual meticulousness, bearing additional documentation. His movement was deliberate, yet minor deviations betrayed conscious effort to avoid attention, a scuff on the carpet, a slight crease in one sheet. Halloway's eyes met Purbright's with understated acknowledgement, his lips pressed in the faintest line of unease. Civility here coexisted with apprehension. Each gesture, however minor, revealed more than the words would admit. As the morning progressed, Purbright compared ledger entries with his observations of committee behaviour, Miss Dumble's notes, and the physical traces he had catalogued: smudges, indentations, and subtle footprints in the rear garden. Each element alone could be dismissed. Together they suggested a pattern of deliberate oversight and measured intervention. Someone had acted with precision, mindful of observation, yet intent on shaping events in a controlled, almost imperceptible manner. In the late morning light, he revisited the church, inspecting the floorboards beneath the nave once more. A narrow track in the dust, partially obscured by shadows, confirmed the trajectory he had previously noted. Careful passage from the vicarage garden toward the ledger and back again. The pattern suggested awareness of observation, a methodical presence whose purpose was recorded more in traces and hesitations than in overt action. As Purbright stepped outside, he allowed a moment to catalogue the day's discoveries: ledger alterations, subtle hesitations in speech, minor physical traces, all coalesced into an unspoken map of intention, civility, and discreet intervention. The town, in its meticulous adherence to propriety, had concealed both anxiety and action, and yet the very patterns of civility revealed what words could not. He paused at the threshold, considering the faint footprint beneath the nave, the erased name in the ledger, and the precise measures taken to preserve appearances. It was a quiet confirmation. The absent Blai, the committee, and the subtle traces of human movement had participated in an understated choreography of observation, discretion, and moral vigilance. And in that recognition lay the silent question that would accompany the town indefinitely. To what end had these minor deviations been orchestrated, and who had shaped the delicate balance of propriety with such precise care?